I'm Ben Max, Executive Editor of Gotham Gazette.
And I'm Jarrett Murphy, Executive Editor of City Limits.
Gotham Gazette and City Limits are partnering on Agenda 2019, a project to set the stage for what promises to be a transformational and controversial year at the city and state levels of government in New York.
We're exploring many of the major political dynamics and policy issues that will be on the table in the year ahead, starting with the fact that Democrats will have complete control of state government in New York, creating a new opportunity for the party to move a long list of legislation on everything from voting reform to abortion protections, to gun control, to rent regulations, to environmental policy, and more.
With Manhattan Neighborhood Network, we're bringing you a short series of discussions as part of Agenda 2019, including one today, our second in the series, which will focus on voting, ethics, and campaign finance reforms and the key political, policy, and budget decisions that will, or at least should be, discussed in 2019 in New York City and Albany. Joining us to discuss today's topics are State Senator Liz Krueger, a Manhattan Democrat, and Susan Lerner, Executive Director of Common Cause New York, a reform group. Welcome, and thank you both for being here.
Thank you, gentlemen. Delighted.
So there's a lot coming up on the table, as we said there in the intro. There's a lot of hope around reform, a lot of things that we know will be discussed in Albany this coming year.
And also, obviously, some things on the state level, the 2019 Charter Revision Commission being one of them, implementation of the Civic Engagement Commission, but we're going to focus mainly, I think, on the state level today.
Yes, well, most of the reform discussion is obviously happening about the state level in 2019. So, Senator Krueger, yes. Your conference is taking the majority. As we said in the introduction, Democrats will have control of the governor's office and both chambers of the legislature. So, on the theme at hand today here, reform, what's top of mind for you going ahead to January?
So my conference has yet to actually formally conference issues is full flight. We're going up to Albany in next week to have more in-depth discussion. But we already know we are committed to voting reform as quickly as possible, same-day registration, early voting opportunities, clarifications and simplifications of the ED-AD issues, which mess up everything here in New York City.
Election district, assembly district.
Exactly, yes. Or what sometimes we call the right pew, wrong church controversy. Or synagogue, as the case may be.
Let's be ecumenical if we can.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We know also that we are committed to closing the LLC loophole as the obvious and low-hanging fruit on campaign finance reform. I think in the intro it was mentioned we're going to pass the Reproductive Health Act. I don't know that people think of that as a government reform, but it's a crucial issue for almost everyone in New York State that we get that accomplished. So we're pretty excited about the goals we've set for ourselves, even in just the early months of our having the majority.
Susan, from your perspective on the outside looking in, how optimistic are you?
Reasonably optimistic. I think the Senate conference and the Assembly now have different problems than they faced previously, which is we literally have decades of dammed up expectations regarding reform and progressive issues moving through the legislature. So some of our expectations have to do with process, and some of our expectations have to do with substantive changes in the law. As far as substantive changes in the law are concerned, I'm very happy to hear Senator Krueger emphasize the voting reforms that we, as part of Let New York Vote, have been demanding: early voting, same-day registration, no excuse, absentee. Please consolidate the primaries. Let's stop wasting money on two confusing primary dates. New York's the only state that can't get its act together to have one primary date. And we need to codify the executive order, which allows people who are on parole to vote without having to jump through. The executive order necessarily has administrative requirements. If we make a change in the law so that people who are on parole can vote, then they automatically become potential voters without having to jump through any extra hurdles. Just fill out a registration form. If you're incarcerated at the moment, you won't be able to vote. That's another long-term goal of ours, is to have all citizens, irrespective of their involvement with the Justice Department, be enfranchised. But for now, if you're out If you're not incarcerated, then you shouldn't have to jump through extra hoops. You just fill out a registration form like everybody else. In terms of the process, what we're hoping is that New York will finally begin to follow the example of other states like Texas and California and Maryland and Massachusetts, all of whom allow citizens to participate in the legislative process by being able to address committee meetings, address hearings, and not have those hearings be testimony only by invitation, which is a very distancing thing that our state does and very few other states do.
Interesting. I haven't heard a lot of talk about that. Is that something that's been on your radar? Or?
Certainly expanding the hearing process. Yes, the Senate Republicans weren't very big on hearings, period. So they did almost everything invitation only and very short term. Many of my colleagues in the Senate have voiced real interest in doing serious committee hearings on bills, which would be new and refreshing for the Senate. We've also been exploring how we can make those committee meetings more real for both the public and the legislators. The concept that you could actually mark up and amend bills in committee, that's a radical notion for New York. It shouldn't be a radical notion for anyone. So I agree with Susan. There's a list that just goes on and on of things we could try and see how it works here in New York.
And also, of course, campaign finance. I'm very also pleased to hear the senator talk about closing the LLC loophole, which is one of our long-term objectives. But we also would like to see a real discussion about further campaign finance, public financing of elections. That's a budget item. It's really something that needs to be funded. It's long overdue in our state, and we hope that we'll see a progression of reforms throughout the legislative session, not a situation where everything is stuffed into the budget and then very little happens and everything is stuffed into a big ugly at the end, but a real open process that takes issues up one after the other and shows the public how hard our elected officials are actually working so that they have an opportunity to gauge what's going on.
So is that something that's going to happen? I mean, you probably both agree on that as you agree on many things, but is that something your conference would realistically pursue? Is that things happen at a more reasonable pace?
So because we've never conferenced it, I remember my conference, not only a new majority, we have 15 brand new senators who have never been senators before. So I'm very uncomfortable speaking on behalf of anyone but myself. But if you look at the last session, clearly Senate Democrats did support public financing and campaign finance reform. And I would be surprised if when we took a survey of our membership this time around, we didn't see growth in support as opposed to the opposite. I agree with Susan because it's a budgetary matter. It will be very important to see whether the governor includes public financing of campaigns in his budget this year, because if he does, I'm fairly certain the Senate Democrats are going to want to support that. It depends on the details. Remember the one year he just did it for the controller's race at the last minute in such a strange way. No one thought it could work. That's not, I don't think, what we're looking for, the Senate Democrats, and I don't think is what Susan's coalition is looking for. But if the governor puts in a legitimate proposal for public financing and campaign finance reform and caps on the amount of money, I do believe that my conference will be, after evaluating it, comfortable walking down that road with him.
And of course, the big elephant in the room is ethics reform. We really don't know where either house stands, except for disappointing testimony on the part of the Speaker of the Assembly, Carl Heastie, in front of the Salary Committee, the New York State Salary Committee last week, where he said, well, we might think about it, because we've been advocating at Common Cause New York consistently that the legislature deserves a raise, and a really significant raise.
Haven't had one in 20 years.
Haven't had one in 20 years, and we're now seeing this very uncomfortable situation where the city council is not just making more money, but almost double the amount that people at the state level are making. And we're seeing people leave the Senate and the Assembly to go into races for the city council to some degree because of financial considerations. We shouldn't have competition between our two most important legislatures in this state based on their salary, but we don't condone the idea that that kind of a raise comes without any obligations on the part of the body to really put in some reforms. And we believe that's absolutely essential if we are advocating for a close to double raise.
And what kind of reforms do you think are necessary?
First, we believe Common Cause's position is ban outside income. Most of the sitting legislators work only for the people. They have virtually no outside income. It's a very small number of people who have any significant outside income. And you know, if we can't get an outright ban, then certainly the kind of limits that you have at the congressional level make a lot of sense.
That's what the governor has said he favors of 15% of the salary.
That's right. And do away with the stipends that are called Lulus. They really are engendered by a desire to increase the financial rewards of being a legislator. If we have a really significant raise, then we don't need to give every single committee chair extra money. And there are way too many committees. So do away with Lulus, limit or end outside income, and allow the legislators to get a really substantial raise.
Two issues there. Not speaking for your conference, speaking
Right,
for
only
yourself.
speaking for myself. Although I will say that in the past, the previous conference I served with from last session did support putting the congressional rules on outside income. We actually took a look and thought the congressional rules made a lot of sense and could easily be rolled in to the Senate and the Assembly. So I would be surprised if my colleagues couldn't be comfortable with that. I've always agreed that Lulus should not be there. I haven't always agreed with all my colleagues on that, who point out because of the very low salary and no increases over the years, that many of my colleagues have really become dependent on their Lulus to help meet their family's financial costs. But as Susan said, since a 20-year gap has left the legislative salaries so non-competitive even with other legislative salaries in our state, clearly we should get a raise and to go into the congressional model for very strict limits on not just amount of outside income, but where you can get it from. Because when you talk about ethics, what you're really talking is making sure that I don't have two bosses, my constituents and some individual law firm or some individual corporation. I don't think anybody really worries that if I write my famous musical and I get a Tony, that's okay, that's just a fantasy, sorry. I don't think anybody's concerned about that kind of income and literary royalties and things like that.
Teaching college courses.
Teaching college courses. Right. It's really the issue that has come up over and over again for legislators being employees of law firms who are then lobbying the legislature or the governor or working on procurement of state contracts while they're sitting in the Assembly or the Senate. Clearly that's wrong, and it's gotten a lot of us in trouble, and you would think people would want to rapidly move away from those kinds of scandals.
Talking about voting reform, there are a few different proposals in that hopper. Some of them are considered sort of low-hanging fruit.
Right.
I'm curious if more aggressive, ambitious ideas like instant runoff, nonpartisan elections, anything like that is in the mix or should be.
Well, certainly we believe that automatic voter registration is something that we should be tackling here in the state. Whether we tackle it in the months before the budget or whether it becomes a budget item is something that we need to work out with the proponents for that very effective reform in the legislature. As far as ranked choice voting is concerned, we hear at Common Cause New York are advocates for having New York City adopt ranked choice voting. We'd hoped that the first Charter Revision Commission would put it in place so that it would have been on the ballot this past November, and it would be in place for the public advocates race, where it's kind of an office bet, pool bet as to whether we're going to have 10 or 12 or 15 people running for public advocates. So if we had that in place, it would be an excellent idea. If indeed we're putting ranked choice voting on the ballot for New York City, then we're going to ask the state to catch up and be sure that there isn't any ambiguity between the ability of the city to have ranked choice voting in its city races and any requirements of state law regarding runoffs.
Are there any voting reforms that you see as more challenging? You know, there's early voting, same-day registration, automatic registration. There's things like moving to electronic poll books. And then I guess I would then make a whole new category for sort of reforming the Board of Elections at the state level and local boards of elections. So maybe we'll keep that to the side for a second. But
so I think everything you mentioned is actually under discussion and could be done. There are a few things that actually may require opening up the Constitution, like how broadly we can go with reasons to do mailed voting. So that's one concern about how far we can go without a constitutional amendment.
that's that no excuse absentee ballot question?
Exactly, exactly. But you mentioned the electronic voting books. Of course, that is a logical thing to do, and frankly is technically easily available, and we should be doing that. Susan's point about instant runoff voting, or I guess answering your question, I've carried a bill like that for over a decade. I think Susan's right. If the city passes something in its charter calling for a variation of it, they will ultimately need to come to Albany, and we want to make sure we give them the authorization they need in state law. Moving to the change in the Board of Election is a greater challenge, because when you look at the Board of Election and why do things keep going wrong over and over again, some of it certainly goes to the fact that you have a duplicative system where there always must be a D, always must be an R, but it's a patronage mill, so often both sides are completely flunking the test of qualifications of what needs to get done. I believe we need to address that. That is a much harder reach, I believe, for two legislative bodies who are also partisan.
Yes.
Right? So I think that that's going to be the bigger challenge for us.
When you pull back, but you both have advocated for reform for many years, what's going to be the measure of success? I mean, some of these reforms would expand the pool of people who can vote, expanding registration. Some might make it easier to actually exercise the franchise. They could do different things to the turnout numbers next election. They're effective. So how will we know that these have worked? What do we want to see in terms of concrete effects 2 or 3 years down the line?
Both of those things. We would want to see an increased number of people registering to vote in New York State, but ultimately an increased number of people turning out to vote in New York State.
And a decrease in the complaints that we have to field in every single election. Common Cause is part of the National Election Protection Network, right? The law firms here on every major election day, general election day, run hotlines of people who call in with complaints. We at Common Cause for presidential election years place nonpartisan monitors at polling places, but we still get texts, emails, and frantic phone calls on election day at our office from people who are confused, who've been given ridiculous and misinformation by the poll workers, and a large number of people who find themselves mysteriously removed from the voter rolls or mysteriously removed from their party registration. We have people who voted in the congressional primary in June, in the Democratic primary, who when they went to vote in the state primary in September called us absolutely infuriated that they were told that they were no longer registered Democrats. How can that happen?
I often prefer, to think of it as that, there are some issues with registration in New York, and there's some steps that could be taken certainly to help it, but New York has more issues with turnout and the actual voting mechanics than with registration.
But they're related, because if what you're hearing from your friends and family is that somebody who's voted in the same place for 20 or 30 or 40 years at every single election because they're very civically engaged is having problems voting, and the new voter is like, yeah, do I have the time to deal with this? It seems like it's really messed up. I have to stand in line for 3 or 4 hours. Is it really worth my time? I think they're very interrelated. I think that the problems we have running a good, efficient, voter-centric election, particularly here in New York City, is a contributor to our low turnout, and it's a soft form of voter suppression.
Well, certainly when it is so hard to vote, even when you think you've gotten everything done in advance and you're just going there to fill out a ballot and put it in a machine, it definitely discourages other people from even trying the process. I agree with Susan. I don't think there's some grand plot to make it go wrong all the time, but it's sort of breathtaking how often things do go wrong on the ground. I mean, the excuses from this election that the ballots got damp and therefore people were waiting 3 and 4 hours to be able to cast their ballot. Let's admit it, it's absurd.
So we don't have a lot of time left, so I want to come back to the reforms that may accompany the pay raises or may not, or may just be on the table. Where are things like term limits for executive officials and state legislators? Is that going to be on the docket? The governor says he favors them.
I've not heard any discussion of that yet, so I don't know whether the governor actually has a proposal. I know that my conference in the past has supported term limits on leadership positions, but not necessarily on actual terms in the legislature. And speaking for myself, I've never been a big fan of term limits. I think people go to the ballot every 2 years to the voting booth, and they get to decide whether or not we continue in office. There are advantages, I agree, to turnover with term limits, but there's some real disadvantages of institutional knowledge and expertise as well. So I've never been a big fan of term limits.
Is this a place of disagreement here?
No, actually,
Okay.
Common Cause nationally has a policy against term limits, but I'd like to point out that we were somewhat validated this past September and November, where for the first time in a very long time, it wasn't the rule that incumbents could just sail through. And as Senator Krueger pointed out, we have a substantial number of new people who've never held elected office before. And that's the voters saying, we don't like what's happening, and imposing a term limit on people they think have gone off the rails.
So to talk about campaign finance reform for a few minutes, you mentioned the LLC loophole seems to be kind of the big target there. When you talk about closing it, what does that mean to you? Does it mean no more donations by LLCs or lower limits, or what does that look like?
Treat LLCs the same way as we treat other corporations. Right now in New York State, there's a law that says a corporation may give a maximum of $5,000 per state election cycle. Not $5,000 per candidate,
Aggregate.
$5,000 aggregate. And individuals have limits, but LLCs somehow, through bizarre interpretation by the Board of Election, never a law, has treated LLCs, limited liability corporations, as if they are individuals. What that means is I might, as an individual owner, control 100 LLCs. If I have 100 buildings in the city of New York, I've got 100 LLCs. And each LLC can give a statewide elected $60,000 per cycle and a senator $11,000 per cycle.
And there are two cycles. There's the primary and the general. So we're talking over $130,000 for each LLC.
Per person running. So it just gets crazy almost immediately when you analyze it. And if you look at certain industries, real estate is always used as an example, and a legitimate one, uses their campaign money through their LLCs to disproportionately influence who sits in the New York State Senate and how they vote on specifically New York City housing issues. So some people don't understand why almost every bill that's been carried that's bad for tenants in New York City is carried by an upstate Republican in some district that doesn't even know what a multifamily dwelling is. None of them exist in their district. And the answer I always explain is, oh, because they will never have to explain their vote against New York City residents because they don't have any people in those situations living in their district, but look at how much money they receive through LLC contributions.
Speaking of Republicans and the LLC loophole, one of the big Republican talking points around that at least has been, okay, if you're going to close the LLC loophole, you also have to do something about union affiliates, because the moneyed interest from labor unions that flows mostly to Democrats also then has the larger union, and then you have the locals, and they can donate almost unlimited funds that way, although not as many as LLCs.
So to some degree, that's a red herring. But in response to that concern, what we at Common Cause have suggested is the whole point about LLCs is that they are controlled by one individual or one umbrella organization, to the extent that you have a decision-making process between the different locals where it's controlled by one entity, right? If the state body for the union can control where all of the locals give their money, then that ought to be aggregated. It's only fair. But in most instances, what I've seen is that each local has, and I'm sure Senator Krueger can speak to this, a very different approval process, and they make the candidates come and really convince the members that they should be supported. And you'll see different SEIU locals are endorsing different candidates. It's not always a unified process, as it is with the LLCs.
There's an overarching critique of campaign finance reform. It applies nationally, probably locally too, or at least it's applied that way, that the more you make it difficult for people to contribute to candidates, the more you're going to have either money flowing into a dark money system of independent spending, or you're going to have self-funded candidates, who none of the rules really apply to, or very few sets of rules. Is that a legitimate concern?
Of course it's a concern. But what happens, the public financing system in our current federal misinterpretation of the Constitution to say that money is speech, from my point of view, from Common Cause's point of view, that's just a misinterpretation, which I think most of the public agrees. It doesn't make any sense. But that's the current rule that we have to struggle under right now. And in that
Citizens
situation,
United decision by the Supreme Court.
and in that situation, what we see without public financing is that when large amounts of private money, often from outside the district, come in, the larger donors within the district start to hedge their bets. They pull back. They don't want to back somebody who probably is not going to end up in office. The small donor reacts differently. In a public matching fund system, the constituents say, who are these people coming from outside with all of this money? They tend to step up to help counter it, and the public financing system is the only bulwark which a candidate has to ensure that they have enough money to get their word out to the voters. That's what we're looking for, not that they're going to be able to match dollar for dollar some outrageous amount coming from dark money PACs, but to be able to communicate effectively, and public money allows you to do that even when you're under attack.
We have 30 seconds left, yes. Senator Krueger, final word. Democrats are about to be in control of the state government. How committed is the party really to the issues we've talked about today? Should voters feel comfortable, people who've been pushing for this long list of things for a long time, that your party is really going to get a lot done and is committed to reform?
I only want to speak for my conference within the Senate, because the Democratic Party is a big, tent universe out there. But I know that the Senate Democrats and the people that I'm serving with and the new ones that have come in are passionate about the reform agenda. If you look at what people campaigned for to win their elections against incumbents, it was exactly the agenda that one of you read off at the beginning of this program. And they are there because activists got out and worked their tushes off for these candidates for months and months and months. The response was phenomenal as far as, first off, in the primary, getting rid of 6 of 8 IDC senators, because people said, enough is enough. This is not what I put people into office to do. I want real Democrats who will follow through on democratic values and not play footsie for gifts and presents and bigger offices. And then the people who moved in November, taking out long-term Republicans who really people thought could never be taken out, was because they pushed on that exact same agenda of progress and reform. So I am very optimistic about 2019 with my new colleagues. In fact, I get joked at already that I'm in the conservative division of my conference, wow. But I'm very excited about the opportunities in 2019.
Okay, well, on that optimistic tone, we're going to leave it there. Thank you both for being here. And thank you for watching Agenda 2019 on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. For more on this series, you can visit GothamGazette.com or citylimits.org. From the Manhattan Neighborhood Network studios, I'm Ben Max.
And I'm Jarrett Murphy.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.